Good morning, everyone. Our text this morning is going to be from Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 29. Again, Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 29. According to the scriptures, God is always at work in the world, and in fact, Jesus himself once said in John chapter 5, "My Father is always working, and so am I." The problem is that from our limited perspective, this is not always obvious. We see pain and suffering, we see war and greed, we experience uncertainty on a daily basis, and in a day and age where we've come to expect immediate results and instant gratification, God's claim to be at work in the world can feel less than comforting at times. The good news here is that Jesus does more than just merely state that God is at work in the Bible. He also explains how God works, and he does this through a parable, that is to say, an illustration that uses common everyday experiences to explain the greater spiritual realities of God's kingdom. This particular parable is found in Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 26 through 29. It's the text that we just encouraged you to turn to just a second ago. I'm going to be reading to it from you in the New Living Translation, and just to give you a heads up, the scripture I just quoted earlier from John and every other scripture you're going to see this morning is going to be from the New Living Translation today. With that being said, follow along with me as I read. Jesus also said, "The kingdom of God is like a farmer who scatters seed on the ground. Night and day, while he's asleep or awake, the seed sprouts and grows, but he does not understand how it happens. The earth produces the crops on its own. First, a leaf blade pushes through, then the heads of wheat are formed, and finally, the grain ripens. As soon as the grain is ready, the farmer comes and harvests it with a sickle, for the harvest time has come." And what we see here in this short little illustration about farming is Jesus explaining how God's continual work in this world unfolds. And we can see it happening in three phases, which are in the title of this message, but they will also serve as the points. We see that God works secretly, then he works slowly, and finally he works suddenly. Again, secretly, slowly, and suddenly. We'll begin with secretly. First, we see that he works secretly. We see this in verse 27 of the text that we just said, where he says, "Night and day, while he's asleep or awake, the seed sprouts and grows, but he does not understand how it happens." The idea here is that plants take root in the ground long before we can even begin to see them sprouting. And in the same way, God's sovereign plans are also unfolding long before we even realize that anything is happening at all. God's work begins secretly. That is to say, his work begins outside of our visible range. And that is why God said in Isaiah, "For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." God is working from a higher scope than we can even conceptualize. And for this reason, we should not be surprised by the fact that his plans are unfolding long before we can even see them. Now, there are plenty of options in the Bible that we can use to illustrate this. We could use King David, we could use Abraham. There are many others, but I believe the story of Joseph is the best fit here. So we're going to stick to that illustration throughout the course of this message. The story of Joseph is foundational to the church, but it's also well known in the world. It was told in an animated musical in 2000 called Joseph, King of Dreams. That's one that I vividly remember. But there's also a movie called Seasons of Grey that came out in 2011 or 2013, somewhere in that range, that is kind of a real life telling of Joseph. It takes place in Texas on a ranch, and there's lots of brothers, and it basically depicts this in what it would be like in a real life day setting today. Joseph was the favored son of his father Jacob, and his brothers, out of envy, staged his death and sold him into Egyptian slavery to get rid of him. And for the next 13 years, Joseph struggled, first as a slave, then as a prisoner, before becoming elevated to the highest position in Egypt next to Pharaoh himself. And in that capacity, God will eventually use Joseph to save all of Egypt and all of his brothers who sold him into slavery to begin with from a terrible famine that was coming onto the world. And so this story of Joseph is a beautiful one. It's a story of faithfulness, forgiveness, redemption, and God's ability to turn even the bad things in life to serve an overall good purpose. And to the point, what's fascinating about this story is that long before anyone knew the first thing about what was coming, God had already set all of this in motion. And we see this through Joseph's dreams. The story begins with Joseph experiencing dreams of his whole family bowing before him. And no one, including Joseph himself, understood what he was seeing at the time. No one understood that what he was seeing was his future as an Egyptian ruler. But in hindsight, we can see that God already had the region's deliverance from famine and the part that Joseph would play and all of that planned out and underway literally decades before the world even realized that there was a crisis to come. In the beginning, God works secretly. The idea here is that he's working long before we realize that he's doing anything at all or that anything's coming. What does this mean for us today? It means that just like with the famine in Egypt, God sees all of the crises unfolding in the world. And he already has a plan unfolding to address them. What does this mean practically? It means that he already has a plan for Ukraine. And he also has one for Russia. He already has a plan for Taiwan, and he has one for China. He already has a plan for the crisis in Iran and for all the other nations involved. He has a plan for the earth and its ecosystem. He has a plan for the economy. Basically, all of the stuff that we're really stressed out about right now, whatever it is, God already knew that it was coming, and he's already at work addressing these issues decades or more before we even realize that there's going to be a problem someday. But there's more. It also means that God has a plan for your life. God has a plan for your life. It means that, like Joseph, God has a part for you to play in his strategy. And alignment with this is where you realize your full potential. God created you. Every one of you. God created you. You are one of a kind. And you have a purpose that God designed you to fulfill. His plan is invisible to us at first, but like Joseph, we will realize it eventually as we remain faithful. And so God works secretly, but he also works slowly. All right, and we see how God works slowly in verse 28 of the text, where he says, the earth produces the crops on its own. First a leaf blade pushes through, then the heads of wheat are formed, and finally the new grain ripens. The idea here is that a plant's leaf blades emerge from the ground slowly, and they don't initially give much indication of their full potential. And in the same way, God's plans also unfold slowly. And as we begin to see and experience them initially, they don't tend to make a whole lot of sense to us. The story of Joseph, if we look at that, we can see that Joseph knew this situation all too well. He began his journey towards ruling Egypt by being sold into slavery there. And after years of faithful service, he was accused falsely of rape and thrown into prison. And in the moment, none of those experiences would have made any sense to him or looked anything like what Joseph had seen in his dreams. Do you follow me? It wouldn't have made any sense to him. But from hindsight, we can see exactly what God was doing through all of that. He was preparing Joseph for the tremendous power that he would wield and the tremendous responsibility that he would bear. He was cultivating the character that Joseph would need to be successful in the role that God had planned out for him. He was instilling humility and endurance and wisdom and servant leadership into Joseph's heart. And he was doing so in the only way that true and lasting character development can happen, through hardship over the course of time. Paul the Apostle spoke of this when he said, "We rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation." God works slowly. And he works slowly for a reason, for a very good reason. Now, what does this mean for us today? First, it means that just as God has a plan for our lives, he is also preparing us for it right now through the experiences of our daily lives. Often this preparation is hard, and it doesn't make sense in the moment, but eventually it will all become clear as we remain faithful. But it means something else as well. It also means that we lean into this preparation process by treating every situation An experience that we find ourselves in, whether it be good or bad, is something allowed in our lives by God for our personal development. And I know that is a mouthful, so I'll say it again. We lean into this preparation process by treating every situation and every experience that we find ourselves in, whether it be a good one or a bad one, as something that God has allowed into our lives for our personal development. What do I mean by this? Joseph's seasons of enslavement and imprisonment alone are not what prepared him for his eventual rise to power. It wasn't just experiencing these things that prepared him. It was the fact that he leaned into each experience. He honored God by giving God his very best, no matter where he was, as he was experiencing them. This is why Joseph rose to prominence in Potiphar's house, and this is why he rose to prominence in the prison. There was no situation that was beneath him. Wherever he was, whether he was a slave or whether he was a prisoner or whether he was ruling Egypt, he gave it his all no matter where he was. The fact that he would lean into everything and give it his best when he was in the small places is what prepared him for when God made him ruler over Egypt. Now, I work at a grocery store, and my experiences there have taught me a little bit about this. And what I mean to say is that at age 44, I found myself working part-time as a cashier at Wegmans after more than a decade as a pastor and a professional. And in that situation, I found myself with 18 to 20-year-old kids as my supervisors. If I had questions or if I wanted a bathroom break, I had to flash my light and ask permission to go to the bathroom. Friends and neighbors saw me running a cash register, and they would look in and say, "Pastor Dan, what on earth are you doing here?" It just looked very strange to see me there. It was a bit humbling at first, is the point I'm trying to make here, and it didn't really make sense to me why I was there. But I did my best to look at that situation as one that God had allowed for my personal development, and I applied myself to it as such. The idea is that I focused upon being the best cashier I could possibly be. And when they moved me out in the parking lot to pull carts, I focused on being the best cart puller I could possibly be. And because of that, it became a blessing. I moved up the chain, I learned a lot of lessons, and it continues to be a blessing in my life today. And in the same way, don't miss the blessing that God is trying to give you through the circumstances that you are currently in. Don't miss the blessing. The circumstances that you're in, whether they're good or bad, there's a blessing there if you'll embrace it. Embrace your circumstances. Don't check out. Don't try to escape. Give it your best, and God will develop you and make you stronger and better through them. God has a plan for your life. He's seeking to prepare you for it. And this brings us to our final observation, and that is that God works suddenly. God works suddenly. We see this in verse 29 of the text where he says, "And as soon as the grain is ready, the farmer comes and harvests it with a sickle, for the harvest time has come." And the idea is that though the process of growth to maturity for plants is slow, the harvest is incredibly fast in comparison. And in the same way, God's work often unfolds over the course of years or decades. But when the moment arrives that it was all planned for, things happen suddenly. And Joseph's life illustrates this perfectly. Remember, he's been a servant for years. He's been a slave for years. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, Pharaoh began having dreams that he didn't understand. And someone in his court, the butler, was aware of Joseph's presence in the prison and his ability to interpret dreams, and he recommended him to Pharaoh. So Joseph was literally taken out of the prison and brought to Pharaoh's court to hear his dreams, and Joseph correctly understood Pharaoh's dreams to be a warning of famine, and he gave a wise recommendation on how to prepare for it. And so in response to this, Pharaoh made Joseph ruler of all of Egypt, second only to himself, so that he could carry out the plan that he recommended. And the idea here is that after all those years of struggling in slavery and in prison, when the time God prepared had finally come, things happened suddenly. Joseph went from prisoner to ruler in literally a day. And it's unimaginable to think about, I suppose, but there are actually stories like this in history. One of them that comes to mind is Winston Churchill. He was an outspoken opponent of appeasing Hitler in the years leading up to World War II. And he was in political exile as a result. No one wanted to hear a thing that he had to say. He was treated like noise to them. But when all of his warnings turned out to be painfully accurate, and all of Europe was falling to Nazi Germany, the nation turned to him for leadership in that moment. And Churchill, in that moment, went from political exile to the Prime Minister of England practically overnight. And as the Prime Minister of England, he kept resistance against Hitler going until the entry of Russia and the U.S. into the conflict turned the tide. The idea here is that Churchill literally was standing alone against Hitler for a while after Europe had fell. Churchill later described his rise to prime minister in this way: "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all of my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." Churchill was 65 years old at the time that he became prime minister the first time, and he had had so many wild experiences in his life up to that moment. But as it turns out, all of it was mere preparation for the sudden moment that God had prepared for him all along. Now, in all fairness, I think it's safe to say that most of us here and most of us watching this are not being prepared by God to lead a nation like Joseph in the Bible or Winston Churchill in England. But God is preparing you for something, and it may be bigger than you realize. Most of us just don't realize how much God is using our everyday and even mundane experiences to prepare us for a moment when all of that preparation will be used by God to save lives or to bless the world around in some impactful way. And one of the best examples of this that I can think of is one that's more recent. It's happened in the life of Captain Chesley Sullenberger, or as he's known to history, he's known as Sully. His moment came. There was a movie made about him. Tom Hanks was in it. His moment came on January 15th, 2009, at age 57, after decades of experience as an airline pilot. That morning, he found himself in the cockpit of U.S. Airways Flight 1549 when it struck Canadian geese about 90 seconds after it had taken off. And when it struck these geese, it took out both engines. They were only a few thousand feet in the air at the moment, and he managed, in the course of 2 minutes' time, to safely land the plane in the Hudson River, saving everyone on board. There was 155 people on board. Sullenberger later described this sudden moment in this way, and I quote, "For 42 years, I had been making small, regular deposits in this bank of experience, education, and training. And on January 15th, the balance was sufficient so that I could make a very large withdrawal." In other words, all those years of going to work every day and giving it his best over the course of days and months and years and decades, just punching the clock and doing his job and trying to do it the best that he could, all of that was slowly conditioning Captain Sullenberger for a moment in history that God had been preparing for him all along. To put it another way, to think of it this way, God knew secretly all along that this plane would hit those geese on that day, on January 15th. And slowly, he was preparing the man who would sit in the cockpit on that day, so that suddenly, when the crisis was upon them all, Captain Sullenberger would know what to do instinctively. So God works suddenly. He works secretly, then slowly, and finally he works suddenly. And what does that mean for us today? It means two things. First, it means that God has put us all here for a reason. We all have a moment coming. We all have a part to play in God's plan. And God is using all of our life experiences to prepare us for it, just as he did with Joseph. But if we don't take advantage of God's preparation by being faithful and applying ourselves diligently to every situation and circumstance that God puts us in, then we won't be able to rise to the occasion when that moment comes. In other words, if we don't take advantage of the opportunities that God puts in front of our lives by leaning into the circumstances, whatever they are, good or bad, our moment could pass us by. We could miss the moment that God is preparing us for, and we could go into eternity having fallen short of our purpose. It's sobering to think about, but it's something that we need to think about. We need to realize that everything that we're doing, even the mundane things of life, we're doing for a reason. And God is preparing us for something, and we need to lean into it, and we need to give it our very best, no matter what. Now, in conclusion, something to think about, not only is God always working, but he's always working purposefully. God has a purpose for everything that we do and everything that we experience in our lives. Paul the Apostle put it this way, and I quote, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them." What does this mean? It means all of the small things, the mundane things, and even the painful things are converted by God into something useful, something that prepares you for your purpose. It really feels like that in the moment, but in hindsight, we can all see it. And understanding this is key to making peace with the pain of our past, and that's something we need to realize. A lot of what we do is boring, and we don't lean into it for that reason, but a lot of times it's the painful things that are the most difficult to redeem and see how God could be using them for good. But we see that that's exactly what happened with Joseph. We see that in the end of his life in Genesis chapter 50. When his father Jacob died, we see that Joseph's brothers feared that he might finally take revenge against them for selling them into slavery as he did. And honestly, I can understand why they would feel that way after what they did to him, as terrible as it was. But Joseph, when he heard this, he was grieved to hear it, and he actually reassured them. He said, and I quote in Genesis 50, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people." In other words, all of this, even the terrible things you did to me, was part of God's plan to save lives. And his capacity to forgive them and to move forward from the pain of the past was rooted in his ability to see all of his experiences, even the most painful ones, as part of God's plan. And I know that all of you are probably carrying burdens, some of you more painful than others. Every one of us has a measure of pain and heartbreak in our hearts, but some a lot. I'm not saying this is easy, but I am saying that God can redeem these and use even these things for your good. And your ability to make peace with them and move forward is rooted in your ability to see them as experiences to grow from. And with that being said, will you pray with me?